So far, I've done a lot of videos showing how to identify yourself through interpretations of the prophecies and the historical movement of the Northern Kingdom tribes. But I've done nothing to demonstrate that the United Kingdom of Israel existed in history and that they came out of the land of Egypt and then shortly after that they conquered the land of Canaan, bringing down the walls of Jericho. These are not allegorical or fictitious stories made up by 5th century BC Israelites that many Christians and academics believe them to be. There's no point in being able to identify you as an Israelite today without you understanding that the Bible stories are historical events that happened to our ancestors. So what happened? Why is it that believers, archaeologists, and even biblical scholars claim that the Bible stories have been made up? The reason they believe this is because they say there is no evidence the Israelites existed as a kingdom in Egyptian records at the time that the Bible claims they would have been there. Nor is there any record of Joshua's campaign in Canaan in the archaeological record neither. Therefore, they came to the conclusion that the Israelites made up allegorical stories and passed them on to their children. This is a fair conclusion to come to without the understanding of how we date all ancient chronology. We use the Egyptian timeline to date all civilizations of the ancient world. This includes ancient Greece, Canaan, Anatolia, Cyprus and Crete. However, the current ancient Egyptian timeline is incorrect by about 300 years. This is way too big a topic for me to go through in one video. It'll probably take me about 6 videos to explain looking at Egyptian chronology. But this has been a sensitive issue within academia for over 50 years. And if you want to understand the totality of what happened, I recommend reading A Test of Time by David Rowe and Centuries of Darkness by Peter James. But to summarize, this 300-year era is why we have a 300-year dark age in Greek history. Between about 12,000 BC and 900 BC, we have no record of any activity in Greece. No births, no burials, no construction. This is why it's referred to as a dark age. And when civilizations seemingly reappeared around 900 BC, they were a continuation of the culture that disappeared 300 years prior. Also, we have the mystery of who were the sea peoples who attacked Egypt. One of the ethnic groups were identified as the Sherden, who bear a resemblance to the Nurgic warriors of Sardinia, but a positive confirmation of this has not been given because of a 300-year discrepancy. And finally, we have Homer, who wrote about the Trojan War in such detail, even though the battle seemingly happened 350 years before he was born. But what I'm going to show is what this 300-year shift did to the Israelites. But to make this video short and easier to understand, I'm going to remove all BC dates from this explanation. I'm just going to show you what period of time something occurred in. For instance, when referring to Israel and the land of Canaan, I'll use terms like Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze, Early Iron, and so on. And for Egyptian comparison, I'll show which dynasty an event would have occurred in. This way, I'll only give you a BC date when using independent ways of figuring out the correct date of an event, such as astrology and retro calculation or the Assyrian records that do not rely on the Egyptian conventional chronology. By doing this, I won't have to go through the long process of showing how the Egyptian timeline is incorrect while still being able to show the evidence we have for the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the United Monarchy period. So let's start by showing when the Israelites would have been slaves in Egypt. To do this, I'm going to take you further back to another biblical story, which is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'll read Genesis chapter 19 verses 23 to 29. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. This is important. This is the town that Lot escaped to, Zoar, and we're going to come back to that later. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. We now have archaeological evidence that a cosmic airburst event obliterated civilization north of the Dead Sea that included the Middle Bronze Age city-state anchored by Tel El Hammam approximately 3,700 years ago. The cities destroyed were Tel El Hammam, that identified as biblical Sodom, Tal Kafrain, identified as biblical Gomorrah, Tal Nimrin, identified as Admah, and Tal Blabel and Tal Musta, making up Zeboim. These Middle Bronze Age cities had existed for over 2,500 years before the airburst destroyed these cities. Tel El Hammam was known as the best watered agricultural land in the region. I'll just get Genesis chapter 13, I'm going to read verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So once again, is a reference to the town close to Sodom and Gomorrah. So we can be sure that Tel El Hammam is the correct location of Sodom, as we have a 6th century Madaba map which shows us the location of Zoar, located north of the Dead Sea, which is just out of the way of the fallout of the airburst. So this was where Lot had fled to, and evidence for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I may have to do a video fully explaining this event, but the reason I brought this up is because this Middle Bronze Age cosmic event happened within the same year that Isaac, the father of Israel, was born. I'll just quickly demonstrate that in Genesis chapter 17, verses 19 to 21. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee, behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. So in this first visit, God lets Abraham know that Sarah will give birth within a year. Now we'll skip to the next chapter, and I'm going to read verse 14. So this time it's 3 angels on their way to Sodom, but they're visiting Abraham. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed, I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. So Isaac is not yet born. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, that they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. And the Lord said, Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence, and went down towards Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. So Isaac is going to be born in the same year as this airburst event. We also know that Isaac gave birth to Israel at 60 years old from Genesis chapter 25 and verse 26. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's hill, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare him. So this is 60 years after that airburst. Jacob in turn entered into Egypt when he was 130 years old in Genesis chapter 47 and verse 9. And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So if the Bible is to be believed, the Israelites entered Egypt 190 years after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which we have archaeological evidence for it happening in the Middle Bronze Age. The Bible tells us what part of Egypt they settled in Genesis chapter 47 and verse 11. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Ramesses is of course anachronistic. That wouldn't have been the name of the area when Jacob settled in Egypt. That was of course Goshen, that we can confirm in verse 1 of this same chapter. Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brethren, and their flocks, and their herds, and all that they have, are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. During the Middle Bronze Age II period, this area was known as Avaris, and I'll go into detail about excavations at Avaris shortly, but first I'm going to use an astronomical event to show one of the pharaohs that would have ruled while Israel was in slavery and demonstrate a revised BC date for their rule. From Babylonian records, we know that there was a lunar eclipse on the western horizon at dawn as the sun was rising on the east. This was followed by a partial solar eclipse at sunset 2 weeks later. Using retro calculation, we know that this rare astronomical event took place in the spring of 1362 BC. This is what was recorded in the Enuma Enlil Tablet 20, letting us know that this is an independent way of dating the end of the Old Babylonian Empire under Samsu-Datani. We can then use the Babylonian Kings list to track further back in time to 1525 BC, which was the 25th year of Hammurabi. This was the year in which he destroys Zimrilim's palace at Mari. From Zimrilim's palace, we see that he received a gift of a golden cup from Yantin Amu of Byblos. We know that Yantin Amu's overlord was Neferhotep I, pharaoh of Egypt during the 13th dynasty. This method of dating her reign is 200 years later than the conventional dating would have you believe, but I don't want to harp on the point. What we really need to understand is that she ruled about 80 years before the Exodus. This lets us know two things. This was around the time of the birth of Moses, as he was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus. I'll just read Exodus chapter 7 and verse 7. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake unto Pharaoh. This also lets us know that Israelites left Egypt at the end of the 13th dynasty and not during the 19th dynasty that conventional scholarship would have you believe. Although it's quite arrogant for them to make the assumption anyway. It's like saying these Israelites of the Bible are fictional, however I'm telling you the Exodus took place in the 19th dynasty. It doesn't make sense. Now let me show you evidence of Israelite slavery during the 13th dynasty. We have a record of Western Semitic people serving hard bondage. This is what the Israelites would have been known as at the time. We had not yet become a nation. We have slave lists of the Brooklyn Papyrus 35.1446, which can be found in the Brooklyn Museum. This is a copy of a decree by Sobek-Hotep III of the 13th dynasty, transferring ownership of slaves to an area around Thebes that contains a list of slave names where over 50% of the names being Semitic in origin. These include names like Menahem. The name Issachar is mentioned 5 times, and even the name Asher appears on the list. We even find the name Shiphrah on the list, which was one of the names of the midwives mentioned in the book of Exodus chapter 1 and verse 15. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives. Notice here he's calling them Hebrews, not Israelites, of which the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. The papyrus also mentions some with a prefix in their name as Apiru, which I'll go into in more detail later, but this is the Egyptian way of referring to a Hebrew. As I mentioned earlier, we weren't as yet being referred to as Israelites during our slavery, as we just read in Exodus. Apiru, or Habiru in the Canaanite tongue, and Sargaz would have been the correct way to refer to us at that time. I might make a point here to say that we were never referred to as the Shasu. I would demonstrate that here, but we have a lot to get through and it would make the video too long. But as soon as I finish this video, I'll record another one proving that we are not the Shasu. So we have documented slavery of Western Semitic people in the 13th dynasty in Egypt, a population that had settled in the land of Goshen or Avaris. Now we can look at the archaeological evidence found in Avaris at Tel Daba during the Middle Bronze Age II period at stratum G. This is just a way of referring to the layer of archaeology found at the level we date to the end of the 13th dynasty. Looking at what we find at this level, we find Asiatic burials. These definitely weren't Egyptians. Their bodies were placed on their sides in the fetal position facing the east. Egyptians are buried on their backs with arms by their side or on their chest. In a couple of burials, the bodies were buried with Middle Bronze Age 2A Canaanite weapons. Some were buried with small Canaanite jars with 2 sacrificed sheep next to the bodies that were not native to Egypt. These were long-haired Syrian sheep. Let me just get a scripture on that. Deuteronomy chapter 26 and verse 5. And thou shalt speak and say before the Lord thy God, a Syrian ready to perish was my father, and he went down into Egypt, and sojourned there with a few, and became there a nation great, mighty, and populous. So these are Israelite burials. We find even more evidence at stratum G in Avaris. The grave sites were made up of 50% child burials, double the amount we would expect for child burials of this time period. And of the adult burials, there was a ratio of 5 female adults to every 3 adult males buried, letting us know that the child burials were mostly male. Israelite boys were being killed. I mentioned one of the names on the Brooklyn Papyrus was Shiphrah, the midwife. Let's go back to Exodus and read further in chapter 1, verses 15. I'm going to read to 22. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife on the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, why have you done this thing, and have saved the men child alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all of his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. So these aren't made up stories in the Bible. There's actual archaeological evidence of this happening to us, which is what we'll look at next, the similarity between the 10th plague of Egypt and the Avaris plague pits. I'll read Exodus chapter 12 and verses 29 and 30. And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. So at the end of stratum G1 at Tel Daba, archaeologists found all over Avaris shallow burial pits with bodies thrown into them. These weren't proper burials as mentioned before, but rather mass graves with bodies thrown on top of each other. Manfred Bietek, lead archaeologist at the site, says that we have evidence of a plague or sudden catastrophe at Avaris. He also noted that the remaining population of Avaris had abandoned their homes en masse and left. This is it. This is the Exodus of the Bible. I'll read Exodus chapter 12 again, but verses 31 and 32. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, rise up, and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as ye have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as ye have said, and be gone, and bless me also. Avaris was one of the most densely populated cities of the Bronze Age. It was estimated that 30,000 people inhabited the city at that time, and they all just abandoned their homes and left. To prove that this isn't just a coincidence and that these were Israelites that abandoned Avaris, I'll show you what happened in Jericho just 40 years after, which you know from the Bible is the length of time the Israelites remained in the wilderness after the Exodus. I'll read Joshua chapter 5 and verse 6. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people that were men of war which came out of Egypt were consumed, because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, unto whom the Lord sware that he would not show them the land, which the Lord sware unto their fathers that he would give us, a land that floweth with milk and honey. This land that floweth with milk and honey includes Jericho. But let me get this out of the way first. At Stratum F at Teledaba in Avaris, it was occupied by Asiatic people as well, but these settlers were fewer in number, richer, and with rudimentary housing, so we can identify them as distinct from the Asiatic people that abandoned the site at the end of Stratum G. I have an idea of who they may have been, but I won't address them today. So if you can accept the Exodus happening at the end of the 13th dynasty, then we also have evidence of the final plague of Egypt and the Exodus, as I mentioned earlier. David Rowe's work will also give you the name of the 13th dynasty pharaoh who drowned in the Yam Suf. He also identifies the 12th dynasty vizier Anku as Joseph, among other details, but I just wanted to show you when they entered and when they left during this Middle Bronze Age period. So now we can get to what happened in Canaan right after the Exodus, and another famous biblical story often thought of as a myth, the walls of Jericho falling down. I'll read Joshua chapter 6, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 3. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And I'll just skip to verse 20. So the people shouted when the priest blew with the trumpets. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. We have evidence that it was the Middle Bronze Age city of Jericho, which is Tel El Sultan, recognized by scholars to be the actual site for Jericho, that had a fortified wall with a glacis rampart that fell in the Middle Bronze Age to B period. At Jericho Trench 1, at the bottom of the trench, they found mud bricks from the Middle Bronze Age 2 city wall that had slid down the glacis rampart. Shortly after the wall fell, we have evidence that the city was burned due to finding buildings blackened by severe conflagration, with some places having ash and debris that was a meter in depth. I'll just read Joshua chapter 6 verse 24. And they burnt the city with fire, and all that was therein, only the silver and the gold, and the vessels of brass and of iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. This really is a checkmate when it comes to dating when the Israelites existed in history. While we have evidence for other details of the conquest, including what was found at Hatzor, for example, the walls at Jericho could only have fell during the Middle Bronze Age 2B time period. So you really have no other choice but to say either the Israelites never existed in history and the Bible stories were made up, or they existed but borrowed stories from the Apiru that occupied Canaan 300 years earlier, which coincidentally is the length of time I say the Egyptian chronology needs to be adjusted. I'm going to end this video here. Sorry about my reading today, I'm doing this very early in the morning. And what I want to do is I want to skip to the late Bronze Age next to show that this was the time period that David and Solomon reigned in. And because I want to go into detail, I'll make this video part 1 and then the late Bronze Age as a part 2, and then I'll do a video on the Shasu as a part 3. So I'll see you in the next video discussing the United Monarchy period. All praises to the Most High.